Remember the Calgary Cannons? Yes, finally, I made it to the planned episode where I talk about the Calgary Cannons in my Remember the Calgary Series. This is up to episode number 24 as someone who mostly is a Calgary sports fan, and that's what I mostly do on my YouTube channel. So of course I say if you want to follow along this Calgary sports fan's journey, just make sure you hit like and subscribe, where I talk about obviously the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders. But I figured last year I was thinking it would be quite a fun project to look back at defunct Calgary sports teams from the past. And of course I had a few sources of inspiration for me to want to do this Remember the Calgary Series, I call it. And for the case with the Calgary Cannons, I did purposely put them towards the end of this series because I felt, as someone who's lived in Calgary all my life, as a Calgary sports fan, I think this team right here, the Calgary Cannons, I think this is the defunct Calgary sports team that I would say most Calgary sports fans miss the most. But to talk about my inspirations, as I always do, in addition to always asking the question at the beginning of the video, back in the 2018-19 WHL season, the Calgary Hitmen did their Corral series, where the Calgary Hitmen were donned on as the Calgary Centennials, the Calgary Cowboys, and the Calgary Wranglers. And I've already talked about those teams already earlier in my Remember the Calgary series. You can see that playlist, episode 3, and then episodes 8 and 9. For Cowboys 3, 8 for Centennials, Wranglers for 9. So you can see those episodes if you want to look on those teams. But the other really big inspiration was Sea of Dead clothing. Let's say, for example, this cap right here that I actually recently purchased from the clothing company Sea of Dead Clothing. So you can take a look at that video right there where I made my very first purchase from them, and unbagging video. And they specialize in selling merchandise from Calgary sports teams from the past. Let's say the Cannons that I'm about to talk about in this video. But they've also branched out, where they've done landmarks and even a radio station that I'm most nostalgic for. And then that Chris Wilson story that was featured on CBC, where he showed off his jersey collection of all Calgary jerseys. Kind of like a very small version of the hockey guy, who also was another inspiration for me to just be active on YouTube in general. So I have all those links in the description below, as well as like my other videos. I put in all the descriptions where I get my relics and information on that I've used in my previous videos and previous episodes. But this case, I say for this team, it's going to likely deserve its own special treatment in my mind, or at least the best as I can. And this might be the longest episode in my Remember the Calgary series, because this is the Cannons I'm talking about. The most, I'm going to say the team that I think most Calgary sports fans miss the most. Alright, before I get into my notes, if you do want to see my previous episode number 23, I talked about the Calgary Vipers. The Calgary Vipers were the last professional baseball team, to represent Calgary that played out of Foothill Stadium. But I'm going to say the Calgary Cannons were the highest level baseball team to represent Calgary, and I keep going back to that. I think this is the team that most Calgary sports fans miss the most. And then of course, going at the intro of my Remember the Calgary series, where I always show like that legend intro card and a few graphics. That song was perfect. I had to use it for this episode. So let's bring up my notes and let's talk about the Calgary Cannons. At least I personally really miss them. And when they existed, it's like I remember going to some games when I was much younger. But then once as you get older and you start making your own decisions and have your own money, this is when we have to say goodbye to the Calgary Cannons. So let's get going, shall we? As they were a minor league baseball team located obviously right here in Calgary for 18 seasons. So they've lasted for a long while, starting in 1985 till 2002. So I was 3 years old at the time when the Calgary Cannons first came to town. and they were a member of the AAA, which is, I say, the highest level baseball team, which was just a level below the major leagues. In the Pacific Coast League, and they played at Foothill Stadium, which is near McMahon Stadium. The Cannons replaced the Calgary Expos, who played in the Rookie Pioneer League from 1977 to 1984. But if you look back on episode 7 of my Remember the Calgary series, we also had the Calgary Cardinals. We were affiliated with the St. Louis Cardinals and the Montreal Expos. But Russ Parker, who was behind those teams, had bigger ambitions, and he was the owner of the Calgary Cannons in 1985. The team was previously known as the Salt Lake City Gulls. That was where the team got from, and when we look back on the franchise history of the Cannons, just like the Pacific Coast League, actually the Cannons go back to 1903 when the league was formed till now. After the 2002 season, the Calgary Cannons. So Homer Simpson should be happy that the Springfield Isotopes did not move to Albuquerque, but the Calgary Cannons did move to the Albuquerque and were named the Isotopes for 2003. And yes, there is a little bit of a Simpsons connection with that as well. So yeah. And then I guess the other question you could ask with the Calgary Cannons is, what logo, what era did you like the best? Because when the Cannons first came in 1985, they had the same colors as the Calgary Flames, just the red and gold. Then the Cannons added some blue to their color. And then this cap insignia I have was like in the mid-1990s. And then in late 1998, we rebranded with that other logo, with that cute, aggressive-looking cannon, and added some gold in it. And then, seeing that the Calgary Cannons were affiliated with a AAA team, well, for much of the history of the Calgary Cannons, and also I'll touch upon a lot of players that played over 10 seasons in the major leagues, we had some big names that ultimately made it to the big leagues and made big things over the years that we had the Calgary Cannons. So when we first moved, when the team moved from Salt Lake City to Calgary, they continued their affiliation with the Seattle Mariners. So from 1985 till 1994, the Calgary Cannons were affiliated with the Seattle Mariners, which makes sense. We are a quick flight away to Seattle within a couple hours. However, I'll touch upon the history. Eventually, we changed affiliations because the Seattle Mariners, I guess, also was able to get an affiliated team with Tacoma, Washington. And then this is where it kind of got wonky, I would say, in my mind. In terms of where Calgary's relocated, being a AAA team as the team just below the farm team for the Major League team, it made it a little difficult, which you could say that plus the stadium is a big reason why eventually we had to say goodbye to the Calgary Cannons. So after when we were affiliated with the Seattle Mariners, the Calgary Cannons were affiliated with the Pittsburgh Pirates from 1995 till 1997. And then in 1998, the Calgary Cannons were affiliated with the Chicago White Sox for one season. And then towards the end of the tenure, from 1999 till 2002, the Calgary Cannons were affiliated with the Florida Marlins, which are now, the team is now rebranded as the Miami Marlins, but they were first coming into the league as the Florida Marlins. So the Calgary Cannons were affiliated with 4 teams during their history, but for much of the history, they were affiliated with the Seattle Mariners in their early days. So that's where you can get a connection of where some players eventually made it to the big leagues, spent some time right here in Calgary. Not for a long time. I mean, there was a couple players that we'll touch upon that you could say were synonymous, that they spent some time with the Calgary Cannons. But the nature of it being a AAA team is that we have aspirations to get to the show, the major leagues. We didn't have like one player that played, all 18 seasons with the Calgary Cannons or for many years, but there's some big names that I'll touch upon. The Calgary Cannons, minor league titles. Well, they won 3 division titles in their history of the team. In 1987, they won their first one. In 1991, and then in 1998. And then they won the league title in 1998, and they came also close to winning the PCL championship in 1998. And I do remember that, how close we came in 1998. So that is the most success that the Calgary Cannons have had. And then the colors, as I mentioned, well, in 1985 to 1987, the Calgary Cannons were red, gold, and white, which was kind of similar to the Calgary Flames colors when they first came into the league. And the best way to describe the cap is that it had just the C, and then it had red and white for red and a touch of gold. Then blue got added to the Calgary Cannons. As they officially call it Royal Blue from 1987 to 1992. And I'll try to share some relics so you can kind of see the different variations of the Cannons uniforms over the years. And then from 1992 to 1997, which is this era, they were red, royal blue, red, and white. I think this is the era I kind of remember the most. As you know, your mind gets more developed as you get older. And then, as I mentioned, in 1998, the Calgary Cannons had a big rebrand where they added some oiled gold to their color, where they were navy blue, red, and old gold and white from 1998 till 2002. Basically with that, cartoonish cannon logo. And I'm not too sure what's the favorite fashion that I figure the Cannons at. I mean, they all had their unique characteristics, but when it came to going back to See a Dead clothing, this was the cap style that I liked the most over the years. And I'm not too sure how you can describe the mascot for the Cannons, but his name was Wabash, and it kind of looked like just kind of a generic monster, which is kind of a lot of teams' mascots over the years. I mean, Wabash was the name of the mascot, so that's kind of touch on the colors and just touch history. So going into the gist of it, well, the Calgary Cannons, they played 2,538 regular season games in Calgary. So it tells you how long they've been around, and for 18 years. So it's not like they were quickly here for a year like some teams that I talked about in the series. Actually, overall, they had a record of 1,225 wins and 1,308 losses. So they actually had an under 500 record for the entire time that the Calgary Cannons played here in Calgary. And they mentioned they actually qualified for the playoffs 5 times. Actually, the first season they were in Calgary, they made it to the playoffs in 1985, and then they also made it in 1987, 1989, 1991, all as affiliated with the Seattle Mariners then. And then the one year when we were affiliated with the Chicago White Sox, in 1998, we made it to the PCL Championship, but just lost out. And then they also mentions that it was actually the 3rd time they went to the PCL Championship, because in 1987 and 1991, they went to the championship, but did not win the league title. 1998 was the closest that they were to it. And then it mentions that over 400 players who did play with the Calgary Cannons ultimately went on to the show in major leagues in various levels, including A-Rod, Alex Rodriguez. Yes, he did actually play with the Calgary Cannons back in 1994, wearing this hat. Not this hat in particular, but again, that style. Because at that time, back in 1993, he was the first overall pick for the Seattle Mariners in the amateur draft. So let's kind of touch on some notable stats. Edgar Martinez, he also played for the Calgary Cannons, and he is actually in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And I think the big name that I'm going to say, the biggest name that most Calgarians might remember, Danny Tartabull in the first season, as he hit 43 home runs and 105 RBIs. I got the numbers right. Danny Tartabull also played with the Cannons. Proud to say is the first big names, and also highlights Jim Abbott. Yes, that Jim Abbott, the one-handed pitcher. He also played for the Calgary Cannons. That was when the Cannons were affiliated with the Chicago White Sox. As some teams, they go up and down throughout the minors. That's how we got a few names. I'm going to say, given that the Calgary Cannons were affiliated with the Seattle Mariners for much of their history, my biggest what if, now at least we had Alex Rodriguez for the first bit of his baseball journey. I think if Ken Griffey Jr., if he did not went from high school right into the major leagues, I'm going to say Ken Griffey Jr. could have been a Calgary Cannon for a brief time. That would have been a big what if. It'd be interesting to see how Ken Griffey Jr. would have done if he was here in Calgary. The buzz that he could have provided. But at one time we did have the first overall pick in Alex Rodriguez in 1993, and they dubbed him as like the best shortstop ever. He has solid numbers, but one thing happened and that might hurt his chances to eventually get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And then it also mentions that two pitchers of the Cannons, this happened very early in history, pitched no-hitters. Actually, Frank Willis in 1985 in the first season, and Eric Hansen in 1998, or 1988 as I meant to say, when the year we hosted the Olympics. So you had to go back early in franchise history to witness a no-hitter. And yes, in 1985, Danny Tartabull actually led all professional baseball players that season with 43 home runs. But I did find some other interesting articles, one by Toronto Blue Jays Nation, that if you were to fill an all-time Calgary Cannons lineup card, I'm going to say we have some impressive names and some others that were just outside. So history, it talks about that Russ Parker, he operated the Rookie Pioneer League team, the Calgary Expos since 1977 and until 1983. The opportunity to move up to the AAA presented himself back in 1983 when the Salt Lake City Gulls were up for sale. Because Russ Parker definitely had ambitions to have a AAA team here in Calgary, at least with the Calgary Cardinals and the Calgary Expos. That kind of opened the door for that. In December 1983, Parker purchased the option to buy the Gulls with the intention of moving the team right here in Calgary for the 1985 season. And obviously it happened. The Pacific Coast League approved the sale in 1984 and the reconstruction of Foothill Stadium began. If you saw earlier pictures of Foothill Stadium, it's definitely been reconstructed over the years, trying to spruce it up as best as I can, but then eventually that is one of the factors why we had to say goodbye to the Calgary Cannons. And actually there was some time before in the mid-1990s that we came close to losing the Cannons, so we might have not have had them for 18 seasons. And as I mentioned, more than 500 names were submitted in the contest. So that's the other gist of trying to touch on is, why did we come up with the Cannons? Well, 5 finalists were selected out of 500 names to call this baseball team that ultimately be called the Cannons. Well, there was one possibility. It could have been the Calgary Stallions. Maybe the Stallions, because that's kind of the Western Heritage hospitality. Outlaws is on there. Yeah. Well, Calgary did ultimately had a baseball team very, very briefly called the Outlaws. If you go back to episode 2 in my Remember the Calgary Series, after when the Cannons left, remember when we had briefly the Canadian Baseball League? We had the Calgary Outlaws, and you can watch the first half of that video because I talked about 2 Outlaws teams in that video. Well, there's the Calgary Stetsons, for that. That could have been an interesting name. And then the Calgary Chinooks, known for that west wind from the Rockies. Well, we also had a Calgary Chinooks hockey team, if you go back to episode 21 of the Alberta Junior Hockey League when we got that team from Pincher Creek. But then ultimately, Cannons was picked the name. I'm going to say for something different, not to be too cliche and Western all the time, Cannons was the best name to pick. And it says Cannons' name was selected by a panel of local media representatives, and the name was unique at that time as there was no professional or collegiate team in North America that used that name. So I guess it was a kind of an interesting name to be different. So that's how the name came to be. And there's a few other sources that mention those 5 names in the finalists on what to name the baseball team. And then it says the AAA Horizon Calgary. Cannons played 1985 as AAA affiliate of the Seattle Mariners. First game they ever played was back in April 11th, 1985 against the Phoenix Giants. Cannons won that game 6-2, led by Danny Tartabull's home run in the first game history. And he also hit the first home run in Cannons history. Following the 6-2 opening road trip, Calgary's home opener was scheduled for April 19th, but surprise, it was snowed out. And that's one of the wacky weather that Calgary has, as there were attempts to play the following 2 days on the 4th attempt. So it took the 4th attempt for the Cannons to finally play their first home game, because I did remember hearing stories that it was snowed out for their first game. But finally, on April 22nd, the Cannons played the Tucson Toros. Parker threw the terminal first pitch to pitch out to Calgary's mayor at the time, Ralph Klein. Yes, that same Ralph Klein that eventually became the premier of Alberta. And it was led by Mikey Brantley's four-hit game. The Cannons won this one 7-6, the first game at home, in front of a crowd of 4,313 who braved the near-freezing temperatures home happy. That's another part of why I think it's going to be a while that Calgary will get another baseball team, because Foothill Stadium has definitely seen better days, and then it's just we need an indoor stadium because we have crazy weather, especially if baseball starts in April, and sometimes it could still be winter. And actually, I'm just looking at right now, I'm starting to see some flurries as I'm recording on Easter weekend at the beginning of April, recording this, so that could happen in Calgary. The Cannons were a success at the gate, drawing in the first season the cumulative attendance of 270,332 fans in 63 games. The season was also a success on the field. As mentioned, the Cannons won the first half pennant. Keep in mind, back before 1998, they had the first and second half pennant to qualify the playoffs. Cannons won the first half in the North Division with a 37-32 record, earning a trip to the playoffs. And then the Cannons entered the North Division playoff series with the Vancouver Canadians without Tartabull, unfortunately. However, he was recalled by the Mariners before the first game of the series. So that's why we didn't have Danny Tartabull, because he was playing with the big boys in Seattle. Tartabull's loss was significant, though, as he was led all the professional baseball 43-1. So, yeah, I guess how I read it, that he was in Seattle, so we couldn't have him for the playoff series, because the playoffs also happened in September. Calgary lost the best of 5 to Vancouver in 3 games, so we got swept by the Canadians the first season. And then the first no-hitter, as I already mentioned, was from Frank Willis. It actually happened on May 31st, 1985, so once the Cannons finally got playing, they got their first no-hitter. This happened against the Tacoma Tigers in a 7-inning game. And then 3 years later, it was Eric Hansen who pitched the second no-hitter on August 21st, 1988, posting a 5-0 victory over the Las Vegas Stars. Hansen walked only one batter in the 7-inning game. So either at the time they only played 7 innings, or another case with the Calgary Vipers, if there was a doubleheader, they have a doubleheader 7 innings games. And I think Major League Baseball, I think, might have considered that for their upcoming season. Then I mentioned pennant chases that we made the playoffs again in 1987, finishing top of the North Division in the second half at the 46-25 record, with an cumulative record of 84-57. It will ultimately stand as the best record in franchise history the whole time that the Cannons were in existence. And the Cannons lost the first 2 games of the North Division Championship Series against the Tacoma Tigers on the road before we went home and we swept the Tacoma Tigers. And then we went to the finals where we faced the Albuquerque Dukes, and then ultimately we lost that one after splitting the first 2 games. But then the Cannons lost the next 2 against Albuquerque, as the Dukes won their 4th PCL championship in 10 years. So the Albuquerque Dukes at the time, so we lost to Albuquerque back then before we ultimately lost the team to Albuquerque, but it was a different identity. I guess the other thing you can joke with Albuquerque is that's where Bugs Bunny always says, man, I should have made that left turn at Albuquerque. And then it says also the Cannons made their 3rd straight playoff years in 5 years in 1989 by winning the second half pennant, 42-29. The record was represented as the worst to first result, as Cannons club finished last in the PCL in the first half. So we had a big turnaround in 1989 with a 28-43 record. The Guns, they also nicknamed us the Guns at times, faced the Vancouver Canadians in the rematch 1985 North Division final, and as in 1985, we got swept by them again. Bastards. And then in 1991, this was the 4th time that we made the playoffs, as we posted a 45-24 record in the second half. The Cannons swept the Portland Breevers 3 games to claim the North Division pennant, the second one in franchise history. And then they won their first playoff road games in team history, setting up a championship clash with the Tucson Toros. And Calgary won the first 2 games in the best of 5 series over Tucson, giving them 3 chances to win the title. And fortunately, that did not happen, because the Cannons, however, dropped the last 3 games in Tucson. So we won it at home, but we lost it in Tucson, losing the title in the process. And then the 5th games, the Cannons were forced to start Dennis Powell on 2 days rest at that time. Mariners unexpectedly recalled intended starter Dave Flame prior to the game. So that's one of the dilemmas. If you are a farm team, is that you might have your best player, but then they get called up to the big team just in time. And then unfortunately, it also mentions the move left Russ Parker upset and dumbfounded. The relationship between the Mariners and Cannons were never the same after that, which is where, eventually where the Cannons had to find a new affiliate because the Seattle Mariners eventually had affiliate with the nearby Tacoma in Washington. Then it talks about in the 1990s, in 1993, Cannons Football Stadium was identified by the National Association of Professional Baseball Leagues as one of several minor league facilities requiring renovations. This is kind of where the sore spot of the Foothill Stadium started coming in, and potentially we could have lost them earlier. The Cannons were given a deadline of April 1st, 1995, and I guess they were not kidding when they said April 1st, 1995, just in time for the season to start, to complete the renovations. Cannons and the city of Calgary engaged in a protracted battle on who would pay for the renovations. That sounds familiar today, once you try to involve public funds in a sports facility. Renovations did finally begin in fall 1994 and they were completed on time for the next season. So we had a close call there in the mid-1990s. Then in 1994, we saw the brief appearance of Alex Rodriguez in the Cannons uniform, the first overall pick, as I mentioned, in 1993 by then the Seattle Mariners. Rodriguez vaulted through the Mariners organization in 1994, starting with the Appleton Foxes in Class A, and then Double A, the Jacksonville Suns, before Triple A up here in Calgary. Rodriguez was then promoted to the Mariners, playing 17 Major League games before being optioned to Calgary to complete the season. I know that Alex Rodriguez played 39 games with the Cannons that season. And then it says following the 1994 season, the Cannons and Mariners parted ways. And then mentioned that the Mariners had their new AAA team affiliated with Tacoma, Washington, which was much closer to them. The Cannons then signed an agreement with then the second team we affiliated with, the Pittsburgh Pirates, which lasted 3 seasons until 1998. Where then the Cannons were affiliated with the Chicago White Sox in 1998. And then in 1998, I'm going to say, it's hard to say what you would define the finest season. Because in 1998, this is when I would say the Cannons were the closest to winning the title. I mean, we also had that three-game losses against Tucson in 1991. But the Cannons qualified for the playoffs for the first time in 7 seasons then, after 1991, by doing so in a dramatic fashion. Calgary clinched its 3rd North Division pennant on September 3rd, 1998, defeating the Canadiens, the Vancouver Canadiens, 4-3 when Kevin Robertson hit a pinch hit 2-run home run at the bottom of the 9th inning. How about that for some drama? And then the victory was the Cannons' 11th straight, so we had to pull it out of the fire just to get into the playoffs in 1998. And it occurred in front of a record fan base of 8,976, both franchise records at the time. So longest winning streak and most fans in attendance. Back in 1998, I'm going to say this was the peak, and that was after when we rebranded. Then the playoffs, the Cannons defeated the Fresno Grizzlies in 5 games to win the Pacific Conference Championship, the PCL, and then earning their 3rd trip to the finals. After dropping the first game of the final home game to the New Orleans Uppers, Calgary rebounded with a 12-8 and 5-2 wins. Then later in New Orleans to move within 1 game of the finals, the championship. However, as in 1991, heartbreak ensued as the Cannons were unable to clinch the title, falling 8-1 and 4-3. Ouch! 1-1 loss in the championship game in New Orleans as the Zipers win the championship. So I don't think Calgary ever had a chance to win the championship with a clinching game at home. So maybe that could have been different if we look back then. Then after that season, the Cannons switched their minor league affiliations for the final time with the Florida Marlins. You couldn't get any further away for a AAA team with the Florida Marlins for the final 4 years in Calgary. And then relocation. This is where eventually we had to say goodbye to the Calgary Cannons. Citing 6 years of financial losses, Parker signed a letter of intent to sell the Cannons to a group in Albuquerque in 2001 in January. It was not the first time that Russ Parker considered selling the team, as he backed out a similar sale to at least move the team to Portland, Oregon-based group at the last minute in 1999. So at least he held on after that. The sale, which would see the team play in Calgary in 2001 and then relocate to Albuquerque for 2002, which was contingent then on voters in New Mexico supporting the referendum to pay for a new ballpark. So that got pushed off because the Calgary Cannons still played here in 2002. Parker argued that the Cannons no longer made economic sense in Calgary at that time because A, the stadium was badly outdated, and then at that time, keep in mind, this is when the Canadian dollar was much lower compared to the US dollar. This was in the low 60 cents, where you needed $1.50 Canadian to get $1 American. That made it tougher as well, and that's why during that time, that's where you also saw a lot more Canadian teams who had AAA teams relocate because of the economics and the crazy weather. It's definitely here in Calgary. And I said the Canadian dollar was at record lows against the American dollar, placing the team at a disadvantage. In a league that was American-based, poor weather was also blamed, especially with an outdoor stadium, especially earlier in the season, which obviously kills attendance, if you want to go set out in a baseball game. The new ballpark in Albuquerque was approved. However, construction delays pushed the relocation of the team back a year, so that's why the Calgary Cannons at least got to have one more last hurrah in 2002. And then talking about the last game, well, the Cannons played their final game on September 2nd, 2002 against the Edmonton Trappers. And in that game, it was a wild 14-13 victory over Calgary's provincial rival for a sellout crowd of 8,512 fans. The Cannons scored 4 runs in the bottom of the 9th inning to win the game, with the winning run scored on a strikeout wild pitch. So, quite a way to say goodbye to the Calgary Cannons. This sounds very similar to what we do at McMahon Stadium after a football game. It could either be a happy or a sad song. It says the team left the field to the song Happy Trails, while the cannon in right field, there was always a cannon in right field at Foothill Stadium, and it always goes off every time when the Cannons hit a home run. But in this case, when the cannon in right field has been fired every time the Calgary player hit a home run, and it fired a 21-gun salute. So that's kind of like the brief history of the Calgary Cannons. That we had some ups and downs, but ultimately I felt like the reason why the team left was the stadium, and then the economics made it a lot tougher. And I'm going to say, other than the Toronto Blue Jays, there's no AAA teams right now in Canada. And then also the team, as I briefly touched on, they started playing in Albuquerque in 2003, and they're still there today. And yes, they were named after the Simpsons episode, where, if you remember the Hungry Hungry Homer episode, where they were trying to go on a hunger strike to bring awareness, that in that episode they were looking at maybe the Springfield Isotopes were moving to Albuquerque, and then they had that punk mayor saying, "I'm the mayor of Albuquerque." Well, hopefully Homer Simpson is happy that we sacrificed the Cannons so you can keep your Isotopes in Springfield. As I mentioned, that the two teams that was also a naming contest that they had at the time. So yes, the Albuquerque Isotopes, the new franchise, because Albuquerque also had some franchises over the years, was named after that. I mean, of course, since the Calgary Cannons, Calgary had some other teams that played out at Foothill Stadium. Well, we had the Outlaws very briefly in the Canadian Baseball League that only lasted half the season, ending with the All-Star game here in Calgary. Then it also mentioned that the Calgary Dogs, remember the Calgary Dogs? I asked that question in episode 17. They came in 2004 as their Western Major League Baseball team that operated as a collegiate summer team. But in 2005, in the last episode where I talked about the Calgary Vipers, who were an independent baseball team in the North American League, well, part of the reason why the Calgary Dogs are now in Okotoks is because the Vipers and the Dogs had a disagreement with the leasing and use of the Foothill Stadium. So eventually, if you go back to episode 17, the Calgary Dogs ceased operations and then moved shop to Okotoks, backed by the Seaman brothers to build Seaman Stadium. And I'm going to say Seaman Stadium is definitely a lot nicer stadium than Foothill Stadium. But keep in mind, Foothill Stadium was built in 1966. Well, Seaman Stadium was built in 2006. So that's it for baseball in Calgary. As since the Vipers, the only team that uses Foothill Stadium right now is the University of Calgary Dinos, but I think Foothill Stadium is on the chopping block for redevelopment plans. So yeah, that's just a touch on the team history and, Albuquerque and how they got the Isotopes name. So if you look at the all-time record, well, in 1985, overall they were 71-70, but winning the first half pennant 37-32, and then the second half they were 34-38. Mentioned lost to Vancouver. 1986 they were 66-77 overall, with a 36-35 first half, 30-42 second half. No playoffs, and then in 1987 they were 38-32 in the first half, and then the 46-25 for first in the second half, with an 84-57 record, which record-wise that was their best record in team history, as they won 3-2 over Tacoma, but then they lost 3-1 in the championship series to Albuquerque, best of 5 series. And then 1988 they were 68-74 overall. And then 1989 they were 70-72 overall, but then that was the team that in the first half they were 28-43, and then in the second half they were 42-29, and then they lost 3-0 to Vancouver. 1990, I'm just going to go over the overall records now, as you can see in the links, the first half and second half. In 1990 they were 66-75. Then 1991 they were 72-64, aided by the 45-24 second half. They were 27-40 in the first half. That was the year where they beat Portland in the first round, and then lost to Tucson in the championship in 5 games. Then 1992 they were 60-78 overall. 1993 they were 68-72 overall. 1994 they were 71-72 overall. And then 1995 they were 58-83 overall. 1996 they were 74-68, but didn't quite make the playoffs. Then, because they were 4th and 3rd in the respective divisions in their first and second half, so it was a tougher season that season with competition. Then 1997 was the last season they did the first second half pennant. They were 60-78 overall. And then when you go to the 1998 to 2002, well, in 1998 they were first in the division. They were 81-62, and that was the year where they beat Fresno in 5 games in the first round, and then lost to New Orleans in 5 in the second round. And then that was the last time they made the playoffs. 1999 they were 57-82. And in 2000 they were 60-82. 2001 they were 72-71, and then in 2002 for the last season before moving to Albuquerque, they were 67-71, and then overall their winning percentage was 484, with that 1,225 wins and 1,308 losses for 5 playoff appearances. And then, like I said, 1998 was when PCL was done breaking up the season with 2 half pennants. So that's basically all the records that were on here. And then, speaking of the Calgary Vipers, well, actually there was one game during their I think it was 2009, because it was their 5th anniversary season. The Calgary Vipers actually wore the Calgary Cannons jersey as a tribute with the gold lettering during the last era. So, other Cannons that played in the major leagues, well, Jim Abbott, and then there was Jim Archer, and then Rick Arno, and then there's a Scott Bankhead, and then there was a Denny Bautista, and then there was a Jose Bautista, but not the one that played for the Toronto Blue Jays with the bat flip in 2015. That was a pitcher. And then Bret Boone, he's another one of the big stars that played for the Calgary Cannons back in 1992. Then you got Chad Bradford, Darren Bragg, Jay Brierner. He was one of the top pitchers for the Cannons back in the day. Also, he had A.J. Burnett. Yes, that same A.J. Burnett that he did start off with the Pittsburgh Pirates franchise, but he did play for the Florida Marlins. Yes, he also played for the Toronto Blue Jays. And then he won the World Series with the New York Yankees. So yeah, we had A.J. Burnett. Hey, Yvonne Calderon. What made that name significant was, if you go back to my See Ya Dead video where I talked about buying this hat and going through the bag, they threw in a deck of baseball cards from 1981. Yvonne Calderon happened to be in that package when he was wearing the Montreal Expos. So, hey, that was just a coincidence, I'm going to say. And then got Luis Castillo, and then Ramon Castillo, and you had Jason Christensen, Darnell Coles, Vidre Cummings, and then Ryan Dempster. I remember Ryan Dempster for being a pitcher that he played for the Florida Marlins. Well, he's in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. Keep in mind, all the players that I'm listing, they mentioned that over 400 players who played for the Calgary Cannons at one time made it to the major leagues. These are players that are just listed that played 10 seasons or more in the major leagues. So this is just a small sample size of that. And then you got Elmer Descens, and then Mariano Duncan. I do remember a Mariano Duncan that actually played for the Toronto Blue Jays one time. And then you got Mike Felder, Cliff Floyd. Yes, I remember Cliff Floyd on the Florida Marlins when I think he was on the championship team. Then you got Ken Forsch, and then you got Ryan Franklin. Then you got Rene Gonzalez, and then you got Jason Grilly, and then Ross Grimsley. He's another one of the stars that played for the Cannons locally. And then you got Lee Gutterman, Eric Gunderson, Bill Hasselman, Andre Hawkins, Bob Howery, Mike Kingberry, and then Derek Lee. I remember another Derek Lee that played for the Florida Marlins and was a part of the championship. And then you got John Lieber, and then Esteban Loaiza. He also played for the Cannons, I think, when we were affiliated with the Chicago White Sox at the time, because I do remember Esteban Loaiza, who did spend some time with the Toronto Blue Jays in his career. Then you got Mike Lowell, and then you got Ron Mayhew, and then you got Tino Martinez. I'm going to say he was one of the big stars for the Cannons at the time when he was with the Seattle Mariners. You can maybe make a case that maybe Tino Martinez might be good enough to make it in the Hall of Fame. The Big Ben, they called him the Ben Ito. And I mean, his career record, I mean, he had a 271 batting average and a 339 home runs and 1,271 RBIs. And, you know, he was on 4 World Series championships with all the Yankees in 1996. And then when they three-peated from 1998 to 2000, he won, you know, the Silver Slugger scored in 1997. I'm going to say Tino Martinez. He might make a case that he could be someone that you could put into the Baseball Hall of Fame eventually. And then the next Martinez that was listed is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and Edgar Martinez, as he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame actually fairly recently in 2019, as he played with the whole career with the Seattle Mariners from 1987 to 2004, 7-time All-Star, 5-time Silver Slugger Award, led the league in RBIs in 2000. His number retired by the Seattle Mariners. He had 312 batting average. He had 2,247 hits, 309 home runs, and 1,261 RBIs. And he is the only Cannon that's in the Hall of Fame in terms of the Hall of Fame being in Cooperstown. But I'm going to say Tino Martinez, he might make a case for. And there are a couple other players you might make a case for. Let's continue moving down the list. You got Larry Milbourne, Kevin Millar, and you got Paul Marabella, Rich Montalone, Mike Morgan, John Moses, Tom Newfender, Edwin Nunez, and then Ken Osick, Scott Radisky, and then you got Joe Renda, Mike Rollinger, Harold Reynolds, and then A-Rod, Alex Rodriguez. If you just look at his numbers, he's definitely a Hall of Famer. He had a 295 batting average, 3,115 hits, 696 home runs, and 2,086 RBIs. 14-time All-Star, World Series champion in 2009. And he won the Hank Aaron Award 4 times. AL home run leader, batting champion. I mean, he's got the accolades. That could be someone they could say he is a Hall of Famer. But the touchy thing with him, besides personality, whatever you think of him, he got caught with steroids. So that's going to be the interesting thing about how the Baseball Hall of Fame is going to treat that. Because then there was the steroid era that happened, not to sound too political, in the late 1990s, after when the Major League Baseball strike happened. It was that home run chase, you know, with Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens. I mean, all those players, if you just look at their numbers, they'd be in the Hall of Fame, but it's that steroid thing, especially going back to the last episode where I talked about Jose Canseco, who he did release that juice book. Well, I did actually see Jose Canseco play when he went to bat for the Yuma Scorpions. But Alex Rodriguez, it's hard to say if he'll ever be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Numbers-wise, yes, but then it's just all the other extracurriculars. The other players, you got Dave Schmidt, Brian Shosky, Matt Ciantro, Luis Sol, Bill Swift, Danny Tartabull, who was one of the best Cannons of all time, but I'm not too sure if he would ever be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I mean, he did had a 273 batting average. He had 260 home runs and 925 RBIs, and he was only an All-Star in 1991. But at least here in Calgary, you can probably say he is an All-Star Hall of Fame, but not think he'll ever get into Cooperstown for the Baseball Hall of Fame. But just continue going down the list. You got Matt Trainer, Steve Trout, Dave Valley, but Omar Vizquel. I think he is someone that might be someone that you could consider putting in the Hall of Fame. One of the best shortstops of all time. I mean, he has a batting average of 272. He had 2,877 hits, 80 home runs, and 91 runs batted in. But it was his fielding percentage that definitely set from the rest. I mean, he was a three-time All-Star from 1998, 1999, 2002. He won the Golden Glove in his position 11 times from 1993 to 2001 and 2005 and 6. He was a Seattle Mariner. That's how he got in. But he's in the Cleveland Indians Hall of Fame, and actually did end his career with the Toronto Blue Jays in 2012. I actually would think you might make a case for Omar Vizquel to eventually get inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Then rounding out the last list of players that played for the Cannons with 10 seasons more, we had Jerome Walton, Turner Ward, John Wellner, Rick White, Preston Wilson, Tony Womack, Jason Wood, and Kevin Young. So that's quite a list of Cannons that have played here in Calgary at one point and eventually, did big things in the major leagues for quite a long time. So when you look at the Pacific Coast League, well, actually the league is now rebranded as the, now it got rebranded as the AAA West, actually just this season. But the Pacific Coast League actually started in 1903 and ceased operations, being rebranded as the AAA West League in 2011. As I mentioned, that it started off as independent. It actually started off as Class A, independent 1903, Class A in 1994 to 1911. Then it was AA from 1912 to 1945. Then it became the AAA League from 1946 to 1951. Then it was an open league from 1952 to 1957. Then a AAA from 1958 till 2020 before it got rebranded. So that is the gist of the Pacific Coast League. But when I mentioned that the Calgary Cannons, you can see that franchise, can trace back all the way back till 1903. Well, in 1903 to 1955, actually the team started off as the Oakland Oaks. And then it moved to Vancouver to be the Vancouver Mounties from 1956 till 1962. And then it moved to Dallas Fort Worth Rangers in 1963. And then it got rebranded as the Dallas Rangers in 1964. And then eventually the franchise moved back up in Canada. In 1965 to 1969, they were the Vancouver Mounties. And then the team stayed a while in Salt Lake City. From 1970, they were the Salt Lake City Bees. And then from 1971 to 1974, they were the Salt Lake City Angels. And then they were the Salt Lake City Gulls from 1975 to 1984, before moving to Calgary to be the Cannons from 1985 till 2002, and then they've been in Albuquerque since then, from 2003 to 2020, and then that team transferred into the AAA West League. So the Cannons, you could say, actually goes all the way back to 1903, if you've just followed the franchise. So that's something you may not know, that this franchise has been various reiterations. But defunct baseball teams in Canada, if you look at that, Major League Baseball, you got the Montreal Expos is a big one, but the other AAA teams that I do remember, there was the Vancouver Canadians, that teams that we played. I think now they're a single A team. Then you had the Edmonton Trappers, and then you also remember the Ottawa Lynx. Because if you look at Canadian-based teams, obviously the Cannons from 1985 to 2002, and they moved to Albuquerque to be the Isotopes. The Edmonton Trappers, Edmonton had a PCL team before the Calgary Cannons from 1981. They actually stayed till 2004. Edmonton actually relocated to be the Round Rock, Texas, to be known as the Round Rock Excess. So that's what happened to the Edmonton Trappers. Other Canadian-based teams, well, you had the, as I mentioned, the Ottawa Lynx, if I can get down to the Ottawa Lynx. is that's in another league. I'm just saying the Pacific Coast League. Well, yeah, the Vancouver Canadians were also in the Pacific Coast League. That let me get down. Where did Vancouver go? The Canadians that they left from 1978 to 1999, the one that we played, they relocated to Sacramento to become the Sacramento River Cats. So that is the kind of looking at the funked Pacific Coast League teams. The Ottawa Lynx did play in another league. I didn't look it up for the sake of this video. But then I found it's called OutlookLanding.com. They briefly talked about Danny Tartabull, and it touched upon a lot of things about the Cannons' history. If you look at the Foothill Stadium and how it is measured when you look at baseball terms, it mentions in the article that it's measured 345 feet in the corners, left and right field, and 400 feet dead center. And it's almost similar to the King Dome when you look at the field. And the wall is 20 feet all the way around. But they said actually Cannons ballpark is actually very hitter friendly. But Danny Tartabull only managed to hit 43 home runs during his time. And then also, the other thing that I put in the description below, touch upon like all the teams in the cards at the Alberta Dugout Series, where you can talk, where it talks about like all the teams. It talks about 1992 when Bret Boone was there, 1987. Probably could say the best record in Red Sox history. Then it talks about 1988 is meant to say, with the Olympics, and it talks about 1986, 1991, and that the third time we made the playoffs. And then it mentions older posts that it also talks about 1985, the first season in Calgary, and then 2001, which was the 100th anniversary of minor league baseball, and the Cannons were close to the end. If the stadium delays didn't happen, 2001 would have been the last season for the Cannons. Then it talks about 1990 when we had Tino Martinez, and then 1997 where it was the last season before we moved through as the Pittsburgh Pirates. And then it talks about 1989 where that's where I mentioned in 1989 if Ken Griffey Jr. did not play from high school into the major leagues, if he would have made minor league baseball, well, he could have had Ken Griffey Jr. for a bit. So that is all, touch upon the Alberta Dugout stories. It's all in the description below. And then also touch upon, if you look at, StatScrew. One thing I like about StatScrew is if you look through, it breaks down the roster and the stats, but they also highlight like who led the team in stats at the time for each season, including like Danny Tartabull with 43 home runs, 105 RBIs in 1985. Well, let's take a look at 1994, because that's when Alex Rodriguez was playing for the Calgary Cannons. If you look at his stats, if I can find the stats, Alex Rodriguez, here's the pitchers. But batting, Alex Rodriguez, how did he do with the Calgary Cannons in 1994? Well, he played actually 32 games with the Cannons. This said 32. I thought I saw 31 somewhere else. In terms of home runs, if you look at Alex Rodriguez, he actually only had, let's go, I kind of keep finding it here. He actually had 6 home runs and 21 RBIs in 1994, but he had a very, very brief history living up to the name of being the, labeled, they said, the Mario Lemieux of the shortstop at the time, because he was the first overall pick. And managers at the time for the Calgary Cannons, well, we had a Bobby Floyd, who was the manager in 1985. Then we had Bill Plummer for parts of 3 seasons from 1986 to 1988. Then we had a Marty Martinez to wrap up the season in 1988. Then we had a Rich Morales in 1989, Tommy Jones 1990. Then we had Keith Bodie, who was the manager at the Cannons from 1991 until 1993. And then was Steve Smith, who was manager of the Cannons at the time, who was trying to manage Alex Rodriguez to not try to put too much pressure on him. Then we had a Bobby Matcham in 1995. Then we had a Trent Dewitt from 1996-1997 as manager. And then when Tom Spencer was the manager of the Cannons in 1998 when we lost in the finals. And then 1999-2000 we had Lynn Jones. 2001 we had a Chris Chambus. And then the last manager for the Calgary Cannons in 2002 was a Dean Trainer. So I have like all the baseball references, the stats screw in the description below, so you can look through all the stats and all the players that happen to play for the Calgary Cannons. And then I had a Sportsnet article talking about A-Rod, looking back on his days back when he was a Calgary Cannon. But the other thing I want to touch on is that the all-time baseball rosters, there was a Blue Jays Nation. Let's listen to this roster that they pick out as the all-time, they call it the all-time Canadian baseball rosters, the Calgary Cannons. And it just talks about various players and various aspects of Foothill Stadium and the Calgary Cannons. This is what would be the outfield right now if they look at if we were to field an all-time Calgary Cannons team. Well, you got Jay Buhner, who would be in right field. Danny Tartabull would be the center fielder. And then Cliff Floyd would be the left fielder. That's quite an outfield that we have looking just at the Calgary Cannons. Now, if you go in the infield, well, you have Edgar Martinez, the third baseman. And then Alex Rodriguez would be the second baseman. Obviously, Omar Vizquel would have to be the shortstop. First base would be Derek Lee. And then designated hitter would be Tino Martinez. Obviously, both Martinez will have to be there. I mean, Edgar Martinez is in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And then the catcher would be Dave Valley. So that's quite an infield when you look at, including with A-Rod, if you take some of the extracurriculars out of him. So now when it comes to the pitching staff, well, the 5 pitchers that they list, well, you have Jim Abbott, the one-handed pitcher, Esteban Loaiza, and then you got Paul Marabella, Ryan Dempster, and Chad Bradford. So that would be the all-time Cannons roster, according to the Blue Jays Nation article that I have in the description below. But then they say, here are some other players that be on the bench. Well, Bret Boone, who is actually, I think he is the older brother of Aaron Boone. There's a relation to Aaron Boone in the Major Leagues. And you got Tony Womack, Darren Bragg, Danny Bautista, Evan Calderon, that Montreal Expo, and then Bill Hassman. That'll be on the bench. And then it talks about honorable mentions. Well, he mentions Luis Castillo. He played 4 games for the Cannons in 2000. But I didn't think it just feel right to put him in as a short stay. Otherwise, he would have been a lot because his career, he had a 21.9 WHR player, 3-time All-Star, 3-time Gold Glover with over 6,500 at-bats. Then he mentions Preston Wilson. He also played only 4 games in the Cannons back in 2001. I remember he was a Marlin. And one of a very respectable career, but again, too small. They actually mentioned A.J. Burnett as a honorable mention, as he actually only played 5 innings with the Cannons. So we very, very briefly had A.J. Burnett when he actually made a play when they were a minor league affiliate of the Pirates. But I remember A.J. Burnett more as a Marlin, Blue Jay, and a Yankee. Again, doesn't seem like long enough. Then it mentions Roman Castro, catcher for the Cannons, but he had a very decent league. He's minor here because he was thin at the catcher, but he also loved the way that the stadium announcer, Russ Peake, said his name. Related, I was young. And then it mentions Brian Simmons, because he was an outstanding Blue Jay during the 2001 season. In the interest of the journalist, Danny Tartabull gave me a broken bat. So whoever wrote this article for Blue Jays Nation, but that is quite a all-time roster, I would say, looking at some names, some big names, big Hall of Famers that are in the Calgary Cannons. And then the other article, or the other link that I put in the description below, is talking about the Albuquerque Isotopes, where now that's where the team is right now. Albuquerque right now, as I say, they've been there since they've moved from Calgary. They continued their affiliation with the Florida Marlins from 2003 to 2008. And then they've been closer with the Los Angeles Dodgers. They were affiliated with them from 2009 to 2014. And now currently they are affiliated with the Colorado Rockies. So that's just some other tidbits what happened to the Calgary Cannons since they left. They have not won any league titles, but they won 3 division titles in 2003, 2009, and 2012. And they've always been the Isotopes. Black, red, and white are their colors. And yes, the name was inspired by that Hungry, Hungry Homer episode. So that's quite a bit to talk about when it comes to the Calgary Cannons, from what I can find. And of course, there's other websites that I found. Like, I'm going to have to try to share as many relics as I can. Try to find my favorites, but I found a program cover from Fun While It Lasted. Then there was a baseball road trip website, because Foothill Stadium is the name of the stadium. But when the Calgary Cannons were in town, it actually was also referred to as Burns Stadium. named after Burns Meats. So we had some sponsorship at the time towards the end of the tenure of the Calgary Cannons. Then there's collectors.com. I went through that website because I tried to find, Calgary Cannons and try to find as many relics as I can. But collectors.com, I found some program covers. And I did remember, I think they used this on a program cover in 2002 when the Cannons were the last season they were in Calgary. I remember I was in Shoppers Drug Mart one time back in the neighborhood I grew up in. I think it was around the late 1990s. I remember seeing a poster. And it had a drawing. It was a picture drawing. And it had all the great Cannons, like Bret Boone, Alex Rodriguez, and Danny Tartabull, showing their different eras. And then there's Twitter and Facebook, because the Facebook group has the Calgary Cannons, Remember the Calgary Cannons Facebook group. And then there's the TCDB.com, and I think that's the trading card database.com. Try to find some baseball cards, some of these big names. So it's a matter of finding, definitely with this episode, was not having no problems finding any information on the Calgary Cannons, but it's just trying to sift through all the relics. But I'm just finally glad that I was able to finally talk about the Calgary Cannons in my Remember the Calgary series. I guess I'll ask all the questions, like what was your favorite era of the Calgary Cannons, like their fashion? Did you like the red and gold, or did you like this era, or did you like that cartoon cannon logo? What favorite players did you like from the Calgary Cannons? It's interesting that we had some big names that I'm going to say Edgar Martinez. I think Tino Martinez is someone that I think will eventually would get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Omar Vizquel, I say for sure. And then if baseball can, kind of maybe overlook the stigma of steroids. In the steroid era, maybe Alex Rodriguez could get in. And then Ryan Dempster, the top Canadian pitcher. And that's why I say, do you have any memories? I do have memories of going to games when I was younger. But just, much of the history of the Calgary Cannons happened, when I was much, much younger. And didn't fully appreciate it. And then once I started fully appreciating it, I have to say goodbye. And that's why I feel it's important for me to do this Remember the Calgary series, talking about all the Calgary sports teams in the past. But I had to put this team last in terms of teams, because I think this is the Calgary sports team that from the past that I think most Calgary sports fans miss the most. We definitely were a part of many, many great Major League Baseball players. And it's just after with the Calgary Cannons, with the Outlaws, and then the Dogs, but it's a different level. And then the Calgary Vipers. We just couldn't recreate that same thing that the Calgary Cannons provided. And then I wasn't around for the Cardinals and Expos before the Calgary Cannons, but that's the other thing I don't remember is how much tickets were back then as well for going to games. But I wish I could have gone to a lot more games back in the day. But it's just various factors why it didn't happen. And I say, this is the team I miss the most. I think, if Calgary can get a indoor, more modern ballpark, we can maybe try to attract baseball. Because you go to Foothill Stadium now, and I shared in that video, that there's indoor baseball academy. The Okotoks Dogs have embraced but it's just, summer collegiate. There is appetite for baseball in Canada, but this is definitely a tougher market, and I think once we lost the Cannons, that was kind of it. But I have to say, what do you remember from the Cannons? Do you remember the Calgary Cannons? Favorite players, eras, any stories? I've heard lots of people that I know that said that he worked at the games and was quite an experience. So that's pretty much all I can have for the Calgary Cannons. It's definitely been one heck of a video to do, and I'm definitely glad I finally done it. I had to wait till towards the end because this is the last team that I've talked about. However, this is not the end of my Remember the Calgary series, because in the next episode, I'm not going to talk about a team, but I think the next element that I think Calgary sports fans, I would say, also miss is Stampede Wrestling. So I'm going to do the best I can to talk about Stampede Wrestling in episode 25. So, this is the third last episode in my Remember the Calgary series. Stampede Wrestling is 25. And then episode 26, I'll give my final recap and just what I felt like doing this whole series. But As I say, that's all I have for the Calgary Cannons, at least for purposes of making a video, and I'll have to keep trying to find some relics to put in at the end. From online, the Facebook page, Twitter, but man, I miss the Calgary Cannons, and I think so does Calgary. So as I say, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fan's journey, home the Flames, Hit, and the Roughnecks and Stampeders, and formerly the Calgary Cannons, just make sure you like, subscribe. I mostly do talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel with the teams that we have right now. But this Remember the Calgary series definitely has been a fun way to look at Calgary sports teams in the past and do it the best the way I can tell. But other things I do is personal vlogs, attempt at comedy, and I also do share my experiences today I'm on the road at a sporting event, and I've actually been starting to do some more live vlogging, which I plan to do more in the future. So if that all sounds like it'd be interesting to watch, to follow along this Calgary sports fan's journey, you know what you do, just make sure you like, subscribe, and I also have my other social links down in the description below, including all the websites that I was able to find information, relics, and of course my inspirations. With the Calgary Cannons series, my videos there, but the See a Dead clothing, and so thanks to See a Dead clothing for what they do, and and my inspiration. And I had to buy this hat just in time for this video, and in that Chris Wilson story. So I can say, let's go Cannons. We miss you. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. And I'm finally happy that I finally got to this far in the series and made this video. So enjoy some more relics that from the Calgary Cannons, and might tug on some heartstrings here. Do I say I'm sorry or make you feel good again? Don't know. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.